I'm delighted to welcome Tom Turner, who is going to challenge the Mayor's cycleway planning vision and probably quite a lot of other people's cycleway planning visions as well. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Jan, for inviting me. I've been an enthusiastic two-wheeler for 65 years and a London commuter on two wheels for 45 years. My first opportunity to speak about the subject, and I'm delighted to have it today. Can I start by asking, how many of you cycle to work? Good number. How many of you cycle for leisure? How many of you have been involved in cycle planning or design? Well, I'd like to apologise to all of you for describing you as ostriches, but I apply the epithet to your bosses rather than yourselves. I'm sure that nobody is happy with the state of London cycle planning compared with many other countries. My own view is that cycle planning comes very much within the scope of landscape architecture. And so I want to start by discussing the scope of landscape architecture. I'm going to try and do it in 10 minutes, and I know that Jan doesn't want me to go on after midnight, and so...
We will get shut down at 9 o'clock.
And so I've included some links to YouTube videos to fill in on the subjects that I won't have time to talk about. The first thing I want to do is to, instead of answering the question myself about the scope of landscape architecture, to show you a few clips from people speaking about it.
Landscape architecture is a strange discipline. It has existed now for 250 years. Arguably, it starts with Humphrey Repton, 1789. It's a year of the French Revolution too, and it's his business card with a very pragmatic sense. Every time he found a client, he immediately gave him this business card, and he calls himself a landscape gardener. So let's say our discipline existed now for 2.5 centuries. And the strange thing is that landscape architecture has almost no history. Very difficult to find a history, a complete history of landscape architecture. Not very strong in theory either. And even the corpus of landscape architecture is not so clear. So,
I mean, it's this debate, it's cyclical. It comes up from time to time. Should we change it? Should we maybe start marketing ourselves as something else? Is there another way in which we could actually do that? Because, like I said, people don't grasp landscape architecture. If you say you're a gardener, you're a gardener. We know what you do. Say you're an architect, you're an architect. We know what you do. Say you're a landscape architect. Don't. And that is a real problem.
The question I've often been asked is, what is landscape architecture? And a rather weak reply is, it's what we do.
Each of them sees a difficulty in answering our existential questions. The what, why, when, and how, where, who of landscape architecture. And this haziness of definition explains why few people seek out landscape architects when they want new cycleways. Though some landscape architects do work for Sustrans and others work on local projects. I like Jacob's association of Humphrey Repton with the French Revolution and 1789. And I think there are good grounds for seeing Repton rather than Olmsted as the father of landscape architecture. But I see 1794, when Repton published his Sketches and Hints on Landscape Gardening, as the key date. Look at these illustrations. Repton is criticising one of his clients for fencing off his estate instead of using it to provide public goods. Repton was a great theorist. But there are other views of our profession's paternity. Most people see Frederick Law Olmsted as the father of landscape architecture, with some help from Calvert Vaux. Doubtless we also have a mother, but her name is unknown. I too see Olmsted as the father of the landscape profession, but definitely not as the father of landscape architecture. So, who is? Italy has many candidates, including Alberti, Vignola and Raphael. In France, you might argue for Mollet, Boisseau or Lenôtre. In Britain, you can argue for Kent, Brown, Repton, Meeson, Loudon, Nesfield or Geddes. British writers quite often describe Brown as the father of landscape architecture. But the history books, including Newton and Jellicoe, take the art back to ancient times. Agreeing this point, my favourite candidate for the first person known to history for his landscape architecture is Gilgamesh. I made the case in a video and it rests on this quotation. "Go up onto the wall of Uruk and walk around. Did not the 7 sages themselves lay out its plan? 1 league city, 1 league palm gardens, 1 league lowlands, and the area of the Ishtar temple," which was probably more garden than roofed space. And I hope you agree that this master plan is a work of landscape architecture. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving literary work. It was composed about 5,000 years ago and classed as wisdom literature. Gilgamesh speaks of the 7 sages, who were gods of civilization, and he speaks about scenery and function, planting and composition, as though he was a landscape architect. Don't you look at this and think, it's the kind of plan we do in our office? Now, let's go back another 5,000 years, which takes us to Potbelly Hill, Göbekli Tepe, in southern Turkey. It's a 15-metre artificial mound on the highest hill in the area, and it overlooks the Haran Plain, in the region where einkorn wheat was first cultivated. It is a structure, but it's not a work of architecture because it wasn't designed for continuous occupancy. I follow Vincent Scully in believing that sacred sites were chosen for landscape considerations and were sacred long before temples were built. So, this is a work of landscape architecture from at least 10,000 years before Olmsted. As an art, landscape architecture is older than architecture. In 2011, in a book, I described Senenmut as the first great landscape architect known to history. Look at his tools, lower right of the screen. I haven't changed my mind about this and hope you agree that Hatshepsut's temple in Egypt is a work of landscape architecture. Look at the amazing integration of building and landscape. Senenmut's titles included High Steward of the Domain and the Gardens of Amun. I see no reason for calling him an architect. He definitely wasn't a member of the RIBA, and the word architect had not been coined, while the LI and the ASLA still use the term stewardship to describe landscape architecture. The hieroglyph for city suggests a concern with routes for 2-wheelers, chariots actually, but they could be bicycles. Hatshepsut's temple is certainly landscape architecture according to my preferred definition. It is the art of composing landform, water and plants with buildings and pavings to make good places. I've included this point in an e-book on landscape architecture. Historically, the profession has 2 feet, one in gardens and one in urban design. These are the design activities Gilgamesh and Senenmut were concerned with, so we need 2 words to encapsulate these interests. And we've got them: landscape and architecture. But in Britain, when the Institute of Landscape Architects was founded in the 1930s, both its feet were cut off for a logical reason: to set itself apart from the Royal Horticultural Society and from the Royal Institute of British Architects. Today, my impression is that members still have reservations about garden design, but would now like to have even more involvement with urban design. For this to happen, we need a firm theoretical base, and for me, much the best candidate is landscape urbanism. It rests on a strand in landscape theory that reaches back to the first European to use landscape architecture in its current professional sense, Sir Patrick Geddes. And before that, it extends back to Loudon, Repton, Uvedale Price, Il Riposo di Claudio, and the ancient world. The more recent pioneers of landscape urbanism were planners, architects, and landscape architects, which is good. Geddes' ideas lead directly through McHarg to landscape urbanism. But as it developed at the AA in London, at UPenn, and at the GSD in Harvard, landscape urbanism can be one of three things. First, it can be a bucket of bullshit. Some examples here from the bullshit generator, which I love, and here's one of my own. This is a post-structuralist analysis of post-colonial alienation and dissonance, with colour all through the year. Or landscape urbanism can be a theory about professional relationships. The Wikipedia entry describes landscape urbanism as a theory of urban planning, arguing that the best way to organise cities is through the design of the city's landscape rather than the design of its buildings. I guess many of us can agree with this, but to make it real, the theory needs the support of a design method, and that's the third thing that landscape urbanism is. Modernist landscape theory, as in the top row of diagrams, was survey analysis design and included McHarg layers. Postmodern landscape theory was deconstructionist, as in the middle row of diagrams, and included the Toomey and Coolhaas layers from the Parc La Villette competition. Landscape urbanism brings the types of layer together: natural process, social process, and cultural process. I see this as postmodernism, but that's another story. And so, at last, I come to cycling. Since most of us here are landscape architects, I hope you're happy with the leafy analogy. It shows three approaches. The first, which is dominant in the UK, is to plan radial ribs for commuters. In northern France, in the centre diagrams, you often find circular loops for leisure. Holland has both. Edinburgh, which I'm coming to, has an extraordinary variant on the London pattern. On the open cycle map here, you can see the comparative provision of cycle routes. The leafy diagrams are also shown. My preference is the Dutch approach. Now let's look at the three British cities. In each of them, there's an overemphasis on commuter hubs, desperately important though they are, and you can see this in the mapping. In Edinburgh, there's something very odd about the way the routes are disconnected in and through the city centre. It's an extraordinary bit of planning. Some of Edinburgh's routes are really excellent, many on disused railway lines or following river valleys. But riding along Princes Street is a good deal worse than it was in the 1950s, when I first did it. Now have a look at the Innocent Railway cycle route. This is the point at which an excellent commuter route reaches the city centre. I'm sorry if the cyclist was killed. In Cambridge, there are some awful routes above and some great routes below. The ambition of the Greenways plan is terrific. It's an area-wide network, and it's being funded at just about the same level per head as TfL are providing in London. That's super. But in a lecture to the Cambridge Greenways group, I had to say that I'd come from hell and expected to find myself in cycling heaven, but it was only purgatory. I made 4 critical points. First, it's too much like a tube network, planned for commuter use and ignoring leisure use. 2, it lacks the circular connections between the radial routes which a leaf or a spider's web would have. 3, so far there's no evidence of context-sensitive design. Look at Senate House Passage. The upper photo shows how it is, and the Photoshop image below shows how they plan to adapt it for additional cycle traffic. They also want more cyclists travelling through Sheep's Green, which could easily spoil it. The underlying point is that a standard design approach is wrong. There should be a landscape design for each cycleway. Now we come to London, which at least offers a diverse range of cycling experiences. Here's a history of London cycle planning at Tour de France speed. It's a sad story. The London Cycling Campaign and Greater London Council planned the 1981 London Cycle Network, LCN. It was institutionally opposed to segregated cycle lanes at that time, so the money was spent on useless signposting and useless maps. This is a typical scene on London Cycle Network, Route 2. Even with a map and compass and signs, the routes are unfollowable. You have to know them to find them. From the map, it looks as though the LCN was based on direct links between origins and destinations. It wasn't. As the red line shows, it was a backstreet operation, fairly described as a complete fraud, not an A to B connection. On my first attempt, I got lost 6 times and fell off my bike once on a slippery corner. When the network was on main streets, like the A2, there were no facilities except signposts for cyclists. Nobody should ever have recommended this as a cycle route. I think that doing so was and is professional negligence. The photo was taken in 2018. The next plan was LCN Plus in 2002. It was no better, and there was less of it. LCN Minus would have been a better name. Next up was Phase 1 of the Boris superhighways. They were great for the manufacturers of blue paint, but not for cyclists. Great graphics too. The arrows on the map make it look as though the routes went to the edge of London, which was not the plan. The next stage was Phase 2 of the Boris superhighway programme, and it really was great by UK standards. It's bikeable and respectably well designed. We must thank Boris for it, whatever else you may have to say about him. But the name was hype, and nothing was done for ecological, hydrological or scenic values. The gold standard section on the embankment owes its scenic quality to the water and the trees, which may have been planted by Basil Jett's landscape gardener. Alexander Mackenzie designed the embankment gardens. This is the dictionary definition of a superhighway. I used to argue for the name veloways to apply to the UK, but since we're leaving the EU, we better call them cycleways. Way is a useful component of the name. It means a track prepared or available for travelling along, different to a route. Next is Boris Johnson's CYCLEWAY network. It was an unhappy compromise between a commuter route and a leisure route. Many of them were old LCN routes, so we could call it LCN plus minus because of its very limited extent. It was a backstreet operation. They're well worth building, but they're not strategic infrastructure. You wouldn't take your child here on a Sunday afternoon, and nor would you use it for getting to central London on a Monday morning. Their merits are very local, and they should be planned as what TfL calls mini Hollands. Perhaps they should get mini Dutchmen to plan them, or maxi Dutchmen, since it's difficult to persuade the local councils. TfL staff, if not its board members, are now in favour of cycling, but many borough councils are not. Well, I now come to my first cautious step towards planning a cycleway network for East Central London, which is my local area. It's based on a system of ribs for commuter use and loops for leisure use and as feeders. So the components of the network are 3 origin-destination superhighways in blue, but called cycleways, and numbered like roads, so that the A200 is flanked by the C200 and the A2 by the C2. An alternative route for CS4 through Southwark Park. Cyclists appreciate quiet green space. A better location for the Brunel Bridge and an Isle of Dogs superhighway, which is much needed. 2 scenic leisure cycleways, 1 on each bank of the Thames. And a redesign of Greenwich Town Centre as the cycling hub it is for both leisure and commuting. So that's the proposal. Now I'll explain the design method and then the principles on which it's based. The first thing I did was to look for a map of existing cycle facilities. Here are 4 candidates. Top right is the TfL map. It's a fictional work because what it shows is routes that have been signposted. It doesn't show cycle facilities, like cycle lanes or cycle paths or cycleways. It's a map of routes that were suggested 20 years ago. Cyclists now look to apps, not maps, for this type of data. The Sustrans map, lower right, shows the routes it has been involved in planning. But cyclists aren't much interested in who planned routes. They want to know about their quality and their characteristics. The Open Cycle map, bottom left, has the best data. It's produced by volunteers, and it's open source, and it's the best. But it shows routes, not facilities. Finally, top left, we have the Strava Metro map. It shows the journeys, not the routes, of those who use its app. The data is said to come from sweaty young men with mobile phones wearing lycra, but my impression is that it's an accurate representation of cycle movements in East London, and therefore of where facilities should be provided. I wish TfL had an app with sufficiently good information to encourage its use by more cyclists. It would save them buying data from Strava. This is an analysis of CYCLEWAY 1 to show what should have been mapped. The official map is in purple. Below it is my survey data. It marks the dangerous junctions with red lines and shows the actual cycle facilities in blue if they're fully segregated in green if they're shared with pedestrians, and in black if they're shared with cars. The 2017 New London Plan has too much talk about encouraging cycling and no costed plans for building cycleways. We don't need to be encouraged, we need to be helped with infrastructure. After collecting what survey data I could find, the next thing I did was to cycle the routes and, as cyclists do, to make videos of them. I think everyone working on cycle planning should do this as the first thing. Then I did my own assessments and put the videos on YouTube with an Amazon-style assessment facility called Scram, and based on the Crow assessment system, which is Dutch and widely admired. Simplicity is a virtue, and TfL's cycling level of service system is too complicated. My impression is that few people are using it. But as every landscape architect knows, you have to do an assessment before you can do a plan. An advantage of the Amazon-style stars is that even members of the public can understand it and use it. I've put the facility with videos of the routes I surveyed on the LAA website. After doing the survey assessment and proposals I've already shown you, I did some diagrams to illustrate the principles underlying the plan. The first principle was to connect origins to destinations, always providing the shortest A to B connection for long-distance commuting business trips. TfL has started doing this, and since it's the basic principle of all transport planning, you have to wonder why London didn't start doing it 50 years ago. Was the aim to get cyclists out of the way of motorists? Surely not. TfL began using an analysis of cycling potential from 2016 and published a strategic cycling analysis in 2017. I agree with Andrew Gilligan that it's plain common sense and not worth the money. What they discovered is that cyclists want to use TfL's strategic road network to get from main origins to main destinations. Well, of course they do. Then, since destinations can be local as well as strategic, we need safe routes to school and safe routes to the station, the shops, the parks, the hospital, and everywhere else. I favour a leaf and branch cycle network with local routes to local destinations. The third principle was to plan for leisure trips as well as business trips. Cycle commuting has reached 42% in Cambridge and is even heading for 2.5% in London. The number of leisure trips is higher than the number of business trips. It's 2/3 of cycle use in the UK, so I have every confidence that TfL will start planning leisure routes. In about 50 years' time? Circular routes are very well suited to leisure use, as we saw in northern France. In London, you can see this with CS3 and what I call the Royal Parks Greenway and the Queen's Walk Greenway. They form a figure-of-8 pattern and thus several loops, which are great for taking the kids on a day's cycling. The third principle is that London should, where possible, plan greenways instead of cycleways. There are many historic greenway types, so I don't think we should use the term greenway, as Sustrans do, for rural routes only. Sustrans calls urban cycleways promenades, but a promenade is a leisurely walk, especially taken in a public place to be seen by others. Sustrans also talk about green streets for cycling, but street is too often used for roads not designed for cyclists, which is what Mayor Khan is planning for Oxford Street. I favour use of the term greenway in the sense of routes that are good from an environmental point of view, i.e. they should be multi-objective projects instead of single-objective projects. This argument is similar to Merrick's argument that we want to see homes, not just houses, to support the health and well-being of everyone. The fourth principle is that cycleways should be related to as many thematic GIS layers as are relevant, some using survey data about the past, and some using imaginative plans for the future. I've done some cartoon-style examples to show how this might work out. The first example is that cycleway planning should be related to a habitat creation policy, because we all want more wildlife in cities, and having habitats besides cycleways would be delightful. This is being done on a short section of Q1 near the Den in South London. A second example is that cycleway planning should be related to a sustainable drainage policy, because cycleways can make a valuable contribution to surface water management, and it will help in funding future cycleways. The third example is that cycleway planning should also relate to design ideas, to an imagined new future. Wouldn't it be great if Abercrombie's open space plan of 1943, top right, had led to the making of the green corridor he showed along the A200? TfL could then build the proposed Cycle Superhighway 4 along it. The modern equivalent of Abercrombie is, of course, the All-London Green Grid, though its cycle proposals are from the London Cycleway network, and therefore wrong. There are good things about the Green Grid, but this one is too muddled. There's little more reason to interlink parks than to interlink libraries, cinemas or hospitals. Being in one of them is usually enough. The fourth example is that cycleway planning should relate to the social and cultural context. This is Abercrombie's social and functional analysis drawing. Everyone likes it, but I don't know of anyone finding a good use for it, yet. The 2011 census collected a lot of data about London's ethnicity. We've got a Chinatown in Soho, so how about another one in the Isle of Dogs, which has a lot of Chinese residents? China, of course, has the world's best cycleway network. The fifth example is that detailed cycleway design should respond to the landscape character assessments for which many landscape architects are commissioned. To summarise, I suggest a cycle network plan that uses landscape urbanism layers to create context-sensitive cycleways. We should work with transport engineers to plan and design a better, more popular, cheaper transport network. You can imagine the urban landscape billowing across the cycleways in a multi-objective landscape urbanism sandwich. It would let cyclists appreciate and discover the urban landscape while getting from A to B. Cycle planning should respect the single agreed law of landscape architecture. Consult the genius of the place is the old name for context-sensitive design. She's a complicated character and needs to be analysed layer by layer. So, hoping I persuaded you that London should have a landscape cycleway network, the next stage is to think how we can persuade the authorities to build it. I have 3 examples. Kim Wilkie showed how to do it with his Thames landscape strategy. Having persuaded the people that West London needed a landscape strategy, he organised meetings with a wide range of amenity societies and local councils, which all wanted it. Then, Chris Baines has shown the way with his tireless promotion of environmental policy, most recently through the Thames Gateway project. Then, there's my own modest effort to be more like Kim and Chris. This was for a GIS-led approach to a green strategy for London. It was done for the London Planning Advisory Committee in 1990. It was a layered approach, and in retrospect, it shouldn't have shown the first London cycle network, which I didn't realise at the time was a fraud. It should have shown leisure and commuter cycle networks, overlapping in places, like on the Victoria Embankment. The 1990 landscape strategy included 2 outer ring walks, which had been established to a degree. The way they came about, which I happily pass on to you, was to explain the proposal while travelling south on the Northern Line. You can also watch me doing the fastest cost estimate of my life.
We could have a London where it would be possible to get from virtually anywhere to anywhere along leafy walks. A London where you could cycle or walk to work through green corridors that would run right through the city. Well, does it seem like an impossible dream? So did the idea of travelling underneath the capital when it was first thought of. The underground dream has turned rather sour, though you can't help thinking it would never have got so bad if every Minister of Transport had been forced to spend an hour a day down here. Tom Turner believes we really could create a leafy alternative for many commuters. His view carries some weight because he's Director of Landscape Architecture at a London Polytechnic. He says we already have the beginnings of a network of walks.
There are about 132 miles of existing long-distance footpath, and we can join those up together, make use of other routes, and have a 1,000-mile network.
Miles
a
and
full
miles.
1,000 miles, yes.
Would it link up with the tube?
Yes, there should be a star of footpaths connecting each station to the long-distance paths, so that you can start your day with a very nice walk to the station and finish it with a very nice walk from the station.
There is a quicker way, of course, and its apostles are just as keen to see the capital opened up for their way of commuting. This wobble of cyclists are all members of the LCC, which these days stands for the London Cycling Campaign. They want 1,000 miles of cycling paths, and they want paths that link up. At the moment, cyclists riding to work can only go so far before they come to a roundabout or a junction, and then they must either make a long walk round or take their lives in their hands. For walkers, it's worse. There may be 132 miles of walks already open, but if you try to walk into central London, you're going to be very late for work. The walks all peter out, or they run into obstructions like this. They don't link up. Well, will they ever? What's it going to take to drive green pathways right into the centre? Well, remarkably little, according to Tom Turner and the cyclist spokesman. They say it could be done soon and cheaply.
You need to survey the routes, to map them, and to signpost them. And then you need some money to do that.
How much money?
Well, I think you could do an awful lot for, say, the cost of the Hammersmith flyover. 30 million?
I think there's no doubt about it. It could be implemented by the end of the century.
My warmest and coldest memory of London cycling is from 1979. I'd been in the British Library reading about garden history from about 9 a.m. when it opened to 9 p.m. when it closed. There'd been a little bit of snow in the morning, and in the evening the pavements were covered in snow and the roads were clear. I set off to cycle home and diverted through Hyde Park and rode along the Serpentine. It was like a frozen river lit by the moon. Geese were waddling on the ice. I was waddling on my bike. I was the only person there. It was fabulous, and an example of the highly diverse cycling experiences that a landscape-led cycle network could provide for London. So I conclude, as Hal did on 21st February, by urging the Landscape Institute to expand its involvement in London landscape planning. Here's what Hal said.
I would like the Landscape Institute to take up the cause of things like the views that still remain, and the idea that the placing of high buildings should be looked at in a holistic manner across the city. And we are the institute that should be saying that. But the RIBA isn't better because architects enjoy making tall buildings. So if they get asked, they'll do it, of course. So it's us who should be saying, you've got to look at the city as a whole, as an urban landscape, and decide where the buildings are to be here.